kick off just a wee bit of housekeeping and a bit of background as to who we are and what this is. So for those of you who don't know, One HealthTech is a grassroots community that's led by volunteers that supports and promotes better diversity and inclusion in health tech. We operate as a federated community that does everything from meetups to mentorship programs to workshops and skills exchange, and also just tries to kind of support better inclusion by fun and by being diverse rather than necessarily talking about diversity. With great sadness, we were planning on having a really big event at the end of June that was called Humans of Health Tech, and unfortunately, obviously, getting several hundred people together in one room is not ideal in these current circumstances. And so, in response to COVID, we thought, how about we get together all together as hubs across the One Health Tech community and organise a One Health Tech week, which is effectively what you're taking part in now, which is a week-long range of activities, including yoga and coffee mornings and webinars and book clubs and Twitter chats and everything that's from very, very serious health tech stuff to also incredibly light touch and somewhat menial, but also quite wholesome is the idea. So if you would like to kind of make sure you're following on Twitter and also tweeting, then we're using the hashtag #OHTweek. So just last bit of housekeeping. So we'll be kicking off with about half an hour of a chair discussion between Yewande and Sally, and then we're going to open up to audience Q&A. So if you do have questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom that's just got the little Q&A box. We'll be looking at that and moderating it and bunching together questions that are similar, and then hopefully Yewande can ask the questions that you've all been wanting to answer. And as I said again, if you would also like to send the link to other people, then we're also live streaming this on our Twitter account, so one_health_healthtech, and that will be the top post at the moment. Just a little extra thing. This is obviously a time when people are quite stressed, and some people might have strong opinions about things that are discussed, but we can please make sure that you ask your questions respectfully and politely, and just take consideration the fact that other people can also probably see your questions, and so please be considerate and kind in the way you ask your questions, even if for some reason Sally says something that really rattles you. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Yewande, who will be chairing the session. Yewande is a leadership coach and strategy consultant, amongst many things, and without further ado, I will now leave the webinar and hand it over to you two.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Maxine, and thank you everyone for joining. As Maxine said, just as a quick intro of myself, my name is Yewande. I'm the founder and CEO of Atito Leadership Coaching and Consulting, and prior to that, I was a consultant at McKinsey with much of my work in the digital healthcare and strategy space. And I say all this because as someone who's super passionate about leadership, strategy, healthcare, I could not be more excited to be in conversation with Dame Sally Davies today. So Sally, thank you so much for taking the time to be with all of us today.
Oh, I think it should be fun, though. I think you should be center stage. You're a leader, Yewande, and you're young, and that is very important to this group, isn't it?
Definitely. And I would say the same to you as well, Sally. You are definitely a leader, and you are also young in everything that you've done. And just for the few who are not aware of what a trailblazing leader Sally is, here are just a few highlights, right? So Sally is currently the UK Special Envoy on Antimicrobial Resistance. She's the Master of Trinity College at the University of Cambridge, the first woman to ever hold this post, and is also a non-executive director on 4 boards, which includes the Clinton Health Access Initiative. Prior to that, she was Chief Medical Officer for England, Chief Medical Advisor to the UK government, and up until 2016 was a member of the WHO Executive Board. In terms of honor, she was appointed, she received her DBE in 2009, and was also appointed Grand Cross of the Order of the Boss for services to public health and research in this year's 2020 New Year's honors, being the second woman to receive that and the first outside the royal family. So I could probably take up the full hour with loads of questions, but my parents taught me that sharing is caring. So as Maxine said, please do get your questions in, and we'll spend the second half of our conversation taking your questions. So maybe starting off, I always like to start with really important questions, Sally. A little birdie told me that you've recently bought a new Peloton. And for those who don't know, it's basically an exercise bike where you get live streamed instructors basically keeping track of what you're doing. How are you finding your bike?
You really do know what I've been up to. Well, it's hard work. It's totally connected. So not only do you know how you're doing, but you can see how you're doing against everyone else. The great thing for me is that I'm the only 70-year-old on what they call the leaderboard. There's occasionally a 60-year-old, but most people are in their 20s and 30s, with a few in their 40s. So I feel quite good that I'm not doing badly. And for myself, each time I do a bit better than the time before, but it's taking a while. I'm not a biker, but in lockdown, you've got to find ways to get exercise, and this seemed a good way. And my husband's using it too. So there you are. It's getting good use.
Nice. It sounds like there might be a competitive edge there, given that you can see other people's scores and your husband's also getting involved.
Yeah, they're all better than me. So no, it's about personal best, not anything else. And pushing myself. I mean, I also go jogging, and I have a Zoom gym class once a week too that my husband's joined, and that the problem with that is it makes me laugh watching him trying to do the things that we all do in gym classes all our lives. But there you go.
I love it. It sounds like this time of confinement is bringing you closer to your husband, and you're learning new things about each other.
Well, that's true. And I think closer to, we've got daughters in their 20s, and I seem to have at least once a week a FaceTime breakfast with one or other of them and things. So digital has become a bigger part of my life than it was before.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of us are feeling that way. When you think about this period, what are some things that you're missing? I know that you're a big fan of the opera. Yes,
I should be going off to all sorts of operas. It's the Glyndebourne season and Garsington, which for those who don't know it are opera festivals where you get wonderful opera, but also you take nice picnics and make a real event and outing of it. So I miss that, but I mean, I've been catching up on the National Theatre, the Royal Opera House, and various other things on the web. So I'm not doing without culture. What am I really missing? Yeah, it's probably not seeing the family and close friends. Zoom drinks is fine, but it isn't the same. You miss things. Yeah, that connection with others who we love. So how are you finding, I guess, what are you finding particularly beneficial in terms of staying connected to those who are most important to you and the things that are most important to you during this time? I think it is actually making the connections. So at the weekends, we do 2, 3, 4 Zoom social meetings, talking to the daughters all the time. One of mine is a doctor on the front line, first-year doctor, and we've done 2 pasta making classes together with a young woman teaching us. But just making pasta and chatting to her for 2.5 hours has been very therapeutic to hear what it was like, which won't come out over a phone or a Zoom so much, but I'm making pasta and, oh, Mum, yesterday was bad, but the day before was better. That comes out more. Oh, lovely. Very, very nice. And similar to how we as individuals are adapting in terms of how we're living and in terms of how we're finding opportunities within these challenges, we're also seeing the world adapt, right? And especially on the international stage. So, I mean, I've personally been very inspired by examples of international collaboration, the access to COVID-19 tool accelerator being a great example. I'd be curious, from your vantage point, what do you believe is the most important of global, I guess, in terms of global solidarity in science and technology innovations today? Let me come back to that. I wanted to say one other thing. Of course, lockdown is fine if you're not worrying that you won't have a salary, if you've got food, if you've got space. It's really tough for those who are in small spaces with children who need homeschooling or who are worrying they've lost their job or something. My subject, you won't know this, I'm a hematologist by training, and I used to look after the biggest clinic of sickle cell disease patients in the country. And I'm really worried about my team that still do it. I left in 2006, and the patients, and I've been emailing them, checking on them. But it is highlighting the inequalities and how unfair our society is. And I hope that one thing that comes out of it will be more social support and better fairness. And I just felt I wanted to say that. But if we're talking about collaboration globally, I mean, there are some very good collaborations. I think the one that's given me most hope is actually something called the ACT Accelerator. So a number of funders, including Bill Gates, our DFID, the Wellcome Trust, have come together and about 10 days ago launched this accelerator, which is going to invest in speeding up vaccines, not just developing them, but making them happen so that they can come out and help people. It's looking at how to get better PPE and more of it, particularly for low-income countries. It's looking at what medicines there are, and really they raised £6 billion in one day for this. Wow. To accelerate technologies for improving outcomes and preventing people getting infected. So I think the fact that people have prepared, governments, the EU was wonderful, to line up and commit that money is very important.
Yeah, no, definitely. And thanks so much. I think the point around the inequality gap is definitely one that that's important to highlight, because there's, you know, we can be very fortunate being in this situation, speaking around Zoom, but there are a lot of people who these are really, really trying times for that. And I can see that you're very passionate about that topic when you speak about it. Yeah. Yes. What do you, maybe taking each of those one at a time, when you think about maybe prioritizing how best to close those inequality gaps, what are some solutions, both nationally and internationally, that you think need to be prioritized?
Well, I mean, I think there are a number of things mixed up in what's going on. One, if you're poor, it's really difficult to be locked down because you don't have the space. And so the fact that we are now in this country allowed to go out and exercise more and take the children out for exercise is very important. But also, poor people often don't have as good broadband. They may not have laptop computers for their children to do homeschooling. So how do we find a way to make sure that every child has got the access they need to homeschooling, to the home gym, and all the rest of it, and to the contact with other children? So I would love to see us make a big effort to make sure, and some philanthropist was asking where could they give money, and I pointed them to Bernardo's and various other charities for that specific reason, to try and get computing and broadband to all these children. I think then there's the food issue. If you're poor, it seems to me from my weekly bag of food that prices have gone up. There are very few cheap offers, prices have gone up. And so how are we making sure that these people are getting good, nourishing food and probably not paying for it? Because if they can't afford it, they still need it. And we as a society should make sure they get it. So it's about getting out and exercise. It's about making sure that they're supported and well fed. And that isn't charity, that is their right, that they can be connected and benefit from schooling and not miss out. And then how we rebuild society to bring those people back in to have worthwhile jobs and things in the future. And that's going to be difficult, but we are going to have to do it. Or you think about the families where, because they're poor and they're in kind of key worker roles, still have to go to work. So they're at much greater risk. What are we doing to help them so that diminish their risks? You know, protecting bus drivers. The death rate in bus drivers is not just lamentable, it is a failure of our society. And we owe it to them to find ways to protect them, whether it's perspex around them, to to do things so that they are not giving their lives. What did we call it in the war? The ultimate sacrifice. They shouldn't have to. That is wrong.
Yeah, yeah. And it sounds like the reduction in the gap is something that I'm almost hearing you say that it sounds like the reduction in the gap is something that's always needed, but given where we are now, it's just really amplified it and made it so much more important to focus on in this time and going beyond.
Yeah, and I think it's now, how do we support people and make sure their children don't miss out, but then in the future, how do we rebuild our society to be fairer?
Definitely. And going back to what you mentioned around the ASK Accelerator, it's really interesting because it feels like we've never had such a rapid, I mean, there might have been that I'm not aware of, but such a rapid international alliance before. Why do you think that's the case? Like, why suddenly just now? Why maybe there hasn't been as much, quick collaboration in the past?
I think it has been speeded up dramatically. And that is, of course, because COVID risks impacting the people with money. I mean, it's all very well if you're a film star and you live in a private home and you have a private jet to take you to another home. That's not part of this. But it is impacting politicians. Our own Prime Minister ended up seriously ill in hospital. No one is totally safe from getting it. And that really focuses the mind. We talk about safety in the aircraft industry, the airline industry. And what you always have to remember is if a plane goes down, the pilot goes with it. They have an interest in that safety. So I'm not suggesting it's selfishness, but it is amazing the speed. And when I look back at Ebola, we didn't get that speed and that much money. Some countries, Britain played a big role, and the States did too, financially, and I mean, many other countries did. Cuba had plenty of doctors they supplied, which were fantastically generous. But it is something about Ebola wasn't going to risk most of us seriously if you had a decent health system, whereas COVID is knocking health systems over. Look at what happened in Italy. Look at how New York was at the height. This is really tragic, and that brings people together for self-protection as well as charity.
So how, with that reflection, how do you think this current situation will impact the future in terms of how international entities collaborate going forward?
Well, we've got a problem in the United Nations, and particularly the World Health Organization, because America has withdrawn from it. And we clearly need to have a multilateral organization like the WHO, where conversations and collaboration can spring up and work together. And the WHO has always done a pretty good job in what we call the normative area, guidance and common good sense based on science. So we need to find ways to bring America back into the fold, not just with it for its money, but its scientific contribution, and the fact that we will be an unbalanced, weaker world without one of the superpowers there. So I think that will be complex because it's raw politics, and I'm not going there. But some of the other collaborations, I think, are set up and will have a life beyond. Perhaps because I'm a glass half full person, I reckon that, but we need them to. And we'll need to look at different collaborations. I think it's very interesting, the strong role the European Commission has played in developing this ACT accelerator. I think it's fantastic. How will regional entities come out of this, showing collaboration within their regions and then between regions, are the questions I would ask.
Yeah. So maybe going down into kind of communities and people. So the OHT community tends to be quite technophiles and love talking about data. And the pandemic has proven to be a much needed opportunity to sort of capture, aggregate, analyze data at a national level for all of our benefits. Many people have spoken about shifting their attitudes a little bit and their willingness to actually share their data to basically overcome this obstacle and help save lives. How important do you feel national data is during the time of pandemic, and is that any different to non-pandemic times?
Well, actually, I would like to see a lot more data use, aggregation and use more broadly in peacetime as well as COVID times. But I think it is fantastic what is happening, and it is making a difference to the response. As you probably know, all the government's health data is being aggregated by the NHS and Public Health England and used to try and improve how the NHS manages the outbreaks and the pandemic, but how to move forward and where the kind of hotspots and the bottlenecks are. In fact, here in Cambridge, some of my colleagues have been working with one of our top AI people, Michaela van der Schaar, and consented patient data to try and set up AI algorithms to understand better which patients do well and which patients do worse and why, because if you can understand that, you can start to prognosticate as patients come in through the front door and make sure you're giving super care and watching out for those who do badly and moving to more aggressive therapy earlier, because that might improve their outcomes. And it shows you which ones may be better trying some novel therapies and things. So I'm really pro all of this. I hope that people will understand how important it is and support the aggregation of more data, because I think we could understand much more going forwards, even post-COVID. When you get onto the contact tracing, personally, but I would say this because I'm pretty law-abiding, I don't mind whether it is held at the national level, the data about interactions and moving and to find the contacts, or whether it's held at local data. But if people are uncomfortable, then let's do it at regional data, because actually most outbreaks happen in regions, and only if someone moved out of the region would you need, which at the moment they're not, would you need to move it elsewhere. And what the centre really needs to know is it's all clean, or there is an outbreak, not who it is, but how many people they interacted with, and have they been informed, and are they in quarantine. So you could do that at the regional basis. And I do think if people are uncomfortable, it's very important to say, what are we trying to do? At what level must you aggregate the data and use it? And then say, all right, we could go at a higher level of aggregation, but we don't have to. And what are we going to upload higher? And there's no reason to have it anything but anonymized at any higher than a regional level, and possibly even lower levels. So it's a question of how you put the data together based on what the use is, and then how soon can you strip it of its identifiers to protect people. That said, I'm looking at a project where I do think we need to know much more about how people interact. We don't understand the behaviors of people who become super spreaders. Are they super spreaders because of their own physiology? Maybe something in that. But generally, they're super spreaders because of their behaviors and interactions. And only by looking at the large databases of Facebook and Google and Apple and the mobile phones will we be able to understand who are super spreaders, who are super spreaders, and who are above average spreaders, and who don't spread much, what their behaviors are, to look at what matters and what doesn't matter. And if we could understand that, then maybe we could have more freedoms and stop the risk ones, the very risk ones, and not the much more safe ones. So I'm very keen to get at that sort of data and bring geeks and nerds into it, not always classic academics. I think geek nerds can really look at things quite differently, to have those insights so that we can release those who can be released.
Yeah. So I'm hearing a lot of really interesting themes there. So one around, there was almost a sense of being clear about what the data, like the purpose of the data, and kind of going from a frame of mind of, we must have this data to provide us with this information and therefore help us to address these issues, as opposed to data for the sake of data collection or as a means of, you know, to some extent, data at the moment is a bit of a currency, right? So instead of data for the sake of data, only keeping what we must have for a purpose, and anything else either anonymizing it or putting it into a situation where it's not potentially being a threat to any individual person.
I think we owe it to people to protect them, but they, in a complex system like ours, when we also have the NHS as a solidarity system, owe it to everyone else to let people use their data if there's good purpose. So why are we collecting this? What are we doing with it? So if you look at the hospital data I was talking about on individual patients, it's all anonymized. You can't tell who is who. But by looking at it and using AI, I do believe, are very likely to improve the number of patients, or decrease the number who die, and decrease the number of days in hospital, because we'll learn better ways to look after people and things. So, and my experience, take patients with cancer, they always want to join in trials, or almost always, even if it might not help them, but to help others who come after them. So I think people in general, if they understand what's going on and they know that the data is not being abused, but is being used with purpose, are helpful.
Wonderful. So going from one topic that you're clearly passionate about to another, antimicrobial resistance. I know that's been a huge focus of your career, and you've long been an advocate for action on AMR, speaking about it on a number of global stages, for example, the UN General Assembly side event, and also in your, I guess, in a lot of the work that you're doing. And you are currently the UK Special Envoy on antimicrobial resistance. That's a bit of a tongue twister. Firstly, for those watching, what does that title mean?
Right. It's unfortunate that we started with that title. We shorten it to AMR, and that's even more difficult to understand. So basically, it's about human nature and survival of the fittest. That if you take infectious organisms, microbiological organisms, they could be bacteria, viruses, fungi, protozoa, you name it, they have DNA or RNA inside them, nucleic acid, which are perpetually mutating, looking by chance, really. And if there's something nasty in the environment and that mutation gives them an opportunity to go on living, they'll pass it through to their children. So if you're treating one of these infectious organisms, say in a human, with an antibiotic, and one of those mutations gives you that bug protection against the antibiotic, you will have antibiotic resistance, and it'll spread. And interestingly, those nasty little bacteria, there are nice bacteria, don't get me wrong, not only pass it to their children and grandchildren, and they do multiply every 20 minutes, but they also can pass it out to their aunts, uncles, cousins, who pass it down to their children. So, you know, it can really amplify. And then you get to a situation where you've got an infection that isn't treatable by that antibiotic. Maybe there's another, but actually there isn't always another. So for instance, 60,000 newborn babies in India apparently die of untreatable sepsis every year. My horror scenario has always been that I would get cancer and go to the doctor and say, well, Sally, yeah, we could give you some treatment, but as you know, treatments for cancer make you more vulnerable to infections. And by the way, your gut microbiome, the bugs in your gut, 30% of them already have resistance. And as that's what will give you infections, do you want to take that risk? Huh? Bucket list versus treatment for cancer that might cure me, but I get an infection. So that was always my nightmare scenario. And then a colleague from India, Chennai, sent me a text and he said, Sally, you won't believe it. I'm now seeing patients where 30–40% of their microbiome are already resistant to the common antibiotics. It's here. My response on the text was, oh shit. I couldn't think of anything else to say.
That's scary.
You know, it is there, it's growing, and it's getting really bad.
Yeah. I was going to ask what keeps you up at night, but it sounds like that scenario, which is actually here.
Yeah, it's that, it's COVID, and it's really interesting that when I moved from hematology into kind of public health, and I became quite interested in infections and in time AMR and now COVID and things. People said to me, why do you put your energy into that? Infections are over. You know, it's the non-communicable chronic diseases you need to worry about. Obesity and other things, asthma and everything. Yeah, but the infections haven't gone away. What people forget is infections are underpinning a lot of these too. So we know cervical cancer is caused by the papillomavirus, an infection. We know that obese animals and likely humans have a certain type of bugs in their microbiome in their gut that probably alters their digestion a bit for some of them. We know that heart disease is more common in people who have bad teeth with grinding gum infection. It's likely that the use of antibiotics very early in life gives you more prevalence of asthma in childhood. So there are all these things that people say are non-communicable diseases. And maybe you don't pass them from one to another very often. I mean, stomach ulcers and duodenal ulcers, all caused by Helicobacter. But actually, you see, it's infection underpinning most of these. And the latest was only this week, a theory that dementia is caused by, as an abnormal result of a particular infection, herpes infection, someone's postulating. Now, it makes sense. Whether it works out to be true is another matter. But we've disinvested in infectious diseases, and we've put much more effort into some of these other things. And I think we need to come back to looking at infectious diseases much more and how they cause so much ill health and imbalance in our health.
Yeah. So with, I guess on that, what would you, if you were to think of a dream scenario over the next 6 to 12 months, and areas that you would want to tackle in the AMR space to change that cycle, what would it be? Where are the main focus areas on this?
So for AMR, you want to prevent infection, then antibiotics or other antimicrobials, antimalarials are not used, so it doesn't matter if there's resistance anyway, and that's back to hand washing and vaccination and things. You want to use antibiotics and other drugs carefully and effectively, and we call that stewardship. But actually, one of the big problems is we have an empty pipeline with very few new antibiotics coming through, and we need drug companies and governments and research organizations to invest in developing new antibiotics. It's not me I'm worrying about so much, it's your age group and your children, my future grandchildren I worry about.
Okay. And I am going to be opening it up to the floor soon for questions, so do send your questions into the Q&A. But I didn't want to finish without looking a little bit closer at your professional journey. So you became CMO in 2010. What is it really like being the Chief Medical Officer for England?
Gosh, it's scary because you're also the Chief Medical Advisor to the UK government. So you have to, well, my predecessor, my successor all take it seriously because you advise the government to the best of your ability. And what I tried to do was make sure I had a lot of scientific advice, and then I'd say, the evidence is this, and your choices are the following. Because actually the decisions, as we're seeing, are political. They come down to what do the politicians think the public, their own party will put up with, their voters and the public. I mean, I'd like to see it that they look what the public will put up with more than their party, but you know, hey, life is political. So there's the advice, but there's also the leadership. How do you get the medical profession and the public health profession, which isn't all medical, to really move forward and modernize and use technology and do things differently? It's fascinating and great fun.
Yeah. And looking back, one of the great successes is in the 100,000 Genome Project. What's the story of its inception and purpose, and how did kind of governance, funding, and team collaboration kind of come into all of that, contribute to the effort?
That's a British top of the world one. So yeah. As you probably know, David Cameron had a son who had a very rare disease, and the diagnosis was difficult to make. And with a bit of suggestion from some scientists, he came up with and announced, I got 24 hours, he's going to, do you think it's a disaster? And I said, no. He announced that we would do the whole genome sequences of 100,000 people. And this was before people were doing whole genome sequencing. They were looking at small bits or single mutations. And there was quite a backlash from scientists and medics saying, oh, give us whatever money there is and we can learn so much by doing small bits of the DNA. Mm-hmm. But actually, he had thought it through. And it proved very difficult to get it set up because, you know, bureaucracies shouldn't really be running fast-moving, fast-developing scientific things. So in the end, I persuaded the government to let us set it up as a startup where the Department of Health was the sole shareholder, and we would use the research and development budget for it, which I held. So I said, I'll carve that out, and we'll do that. And we got an entrepreneur, wonderful man, John Chisholm, who was an engineer, very, very digital, who set up a couple of startups and had worked privatizing kinetics. So he understood government to come and run it. And then we set about doing it. And in the end, with a lot of patient support, it couldn't have happened without, we managed the full 100,000 just before Christmas, of which a lot of them were children with rare diseases. And you talk to the families and they were thrilled we were doing it because they knew their kids had something weird, but what? And they'd come and go for years. The worst I heard of was over 20 years trying to get a diagnosis. Oh, wow. And then we get a whole genome and we can tell them the diagnosis. And for some of them, we could find them treatments. There's one group of over 20 children where they thought they had a funny type of cerebral palsy, but someone did their whole genomes and they had lots of epileptic fits and discovered that if you did deep brain stimulation, electric brain stimulation, they all improved and some of them became fit-free and could go to school. I mean, wow. That group of kids owe their lives or quality of life, and some of them their schooling to this project, and they're not the only ones. So it is really, it's an exciting project. Yeah, no, I can tell as you speak about it. What was the experience? How do you think that impacted you kind of going forward in your career? Because I can kind of feel the excitement as you discuss. Well, I've always been interested in genomics. As I said at the beginning, my subject was sickle cell disease. And of course, that is a single point mutation in the DNA of some people. And if you have one copy of the sickle gene, you're protected up to the age of 1 a bit against nasty malaria. But unfortunately, if you get 2 copies, it gives you sickle cell disease, sickle cell anemia, and it can be really, well, the average life expectancy used to be 42. It's improved with modern treatment, but it's very painful on occasions, and it's life-threatening and difficult. And so I've always been interested in genes and genomes, and so the whole genome project for me was a gift to play with.
It sounds so. So I'm gonna, I've got loads and loads of questions, but I'm gonna move to the Q&A just to see what's coming up from the audience. So let me just have a quick read. Okay, so this is a question around the data piece that we spoke about. So the first question is, do you worry that if some parts of society are more distrusting of sharing their data, it could introduce bias into the insights? And how would you kind of convince people that it's safe to share?
Of course, if the data set's not complete, it can be biased. And so we have to work to stop that. One way is going back to what's the purpose? And once you've worked out the purpose, you can anonymize a lot of it, and then you protect those people. But we don't use data for research without having a protocol, ethics committee permission, data governance permission. It is carefully regulated and monitored. This is not a free world to do what you want with data. And the project I was talking about of collecting data from a hospital looking at patients' outcomes, all those patients have consented and everything. So it's very carefully done. I think it is going to be difficult to do in detailed reviews of why BAME, Black and minority ethnic people, seem to be having worse outcomes, and at the in-depth level, unless the patients agree for their data to be, the data about them to be used. At a high level, you can see that they do have worse outcomes, and we'll be able to get some stuff anonymously that might give us a bit of a guide. But we need to tease out whether the Black minority ethnic bad outcomes is something to do with them, whether it's their genome or their diet or more pollution where they live, or it's something to do with inequalities in terms of finance and housing. Actually, those overlapped, didn't they? But do you see what I'm getting at? We will need, you can do some stuff based on postcode and anonymized and ethnicity, but other things we will need to do much more in-depth to find out the causes. And hey, I plead with people to let us use the data, because if we don't understand it, apart from poverty and inequalities, how do we make it better? How do we make the outcomes improve for those people?
Well, thank you. Next question we have is on your role at CMO. So the question is, what's the toughest decision you've ever had to make or you ever had to make as CMO?
Well, I'm not going to tell you the subject, but there was one occasion when I went to the Secretary of State and said, I really don't like this. And if you do it as a woman and the first woman CMO, I would have to resign. So there are difficult decisions. There are always difficult decisions. I mean, debating about Ebola, whether we should put in place airport screening for people coming in from West Africa, where, you know, it wasn't cost effective, but it would mean you could tell everyone that if they got a temperature, where to go, and balancing all of those and trying to get it right. They are difficult, these decisions. And in the end, the role of the CMO is to give the politicians the evidence, the options, and if asked, say which you would go for, but to understand why you would go for that. Is that your politics? Is it your values? Is it actually the science is overwhelming? And you need to have that kind of clarity inside about why am I, if asked, why am I advising? Because you're not a good advisor, and you won't last either if you're being very political. And I was strictly apolitical.
Yeah. So it sounds like being aware of not just your decisions, but where those decisions are coming from, and almost challenging yourself to make sure that you're making the decisions for the right reason.
And I would try and put the public's good at the center. That was my value that drove everything. And if it was about small numbers, I would think, so if this was my family, what would I want for them? So I would try and do it in that, using those as my frames.
Yeah. And just a follow-up question, because you mentioned that in that the really tough decision that you don't want to tell us the details on, which is fair enough, that there was a comment around, you know, as the first woman in particular. How did you find? I mean, you have a lot of accolades as the first woman to do X, Y, and Z. How have you found that that's impacted your career, professional life in those decisions, and how you've kind of conducted yourself?
I do think I've always had to be better than the men to get the jobs. And I'm sure that'll ring true for many women, even young women, sadly. And then, of course, I am not an honorary man, so I do things my way, and I have to kind of show people that I do it a bit differently. It's difficult to put your finger on, but I think I'm, than many men, by no means all, I'm much more facilitatory and collaborative and things. On the other hand, I can bite balls off if they're trying to give me a hard time. I'm tough as old boots.
I'm not surprised about that at all.
It's interesting being the first woman in a job, because you're kind of redefining the job a bit and trying to show people that they really needn't worry, because most of these things aren't about gender. They're back to values and judgment and leadership and getting on with it. And I've made my career on delivery, making things happen, solving problems, making a difference. I haven't made it on swanning around, pretending I'm important.
Yeah. And looking a little bit, another question here that kind of goes into value. So do you think that this pandemic will result in a sustainable increase in the value we place on key workers?
Well, I think it will for a couple of years. What I think we have to do is use that momentum to try and make some changes in society, to be a fairer society, so that it's a longer term thing. One of the things that worries me is how quickly people forget and relax back into the life they had. And I was assuming when you said key workers, you were going broader than just the NHS, or even in the NHS, remembering the porters and cleaners. But yes, I hope we do. But I think we need to use the momentum in the first couple of years to kind of bake it in some way.
Yeah. Lots of great questions coming. So following on AMR, so the question here is, apart from AMR, of course, what is your advice to the NHS England and NHS Improvement senior executive team at the moment? And it says not COVID, not
about COVID
related.
What is it? Well, I think the big win we should get out of this, because there are so many losses to families and friends, is keeping, I'll use that expression, baking in all the digital gains, you know, outpatients digitally, much more management data collected digitally, so bake in the digital gains and think about how, as we turn the NHS back on, we make it a more modern NHS and a more national NHS. At the moment, hospitals are collaborating, everyone's working, not just really hard, they're working their socks off, but they are working in collaboration and learning together and digital sharing and everything. We need that to stay and to change how our NHS is, from being what I call a cottage industry into a really wonderful national asset.
Yeah, yeah. It almost sounds like that exactly you're talking about, you know, making pasta with your butter. It's almost like things that are happening now that, you know, it's not for indoors, but it's bringing up opportunities. They're quite exciting. So kind of taking those in and getting them to stick even after.
Yep, yep. No, it needs to be a very exciting, well, it is an exciting time. If it wasn't so sad, we'd all be really energized.
Definitely, definitely. So next question coming in, do you think, oh no, sorry. So what does the future of genomics look like? What do you think is going to be the good things that come out from Genomics England?
Well, I think there'll be, I hope it's part of, you know, having a more modern NHS that will do much more genomic testing. So if you get cancer, genomic testing so that you get the best treatment, not based on, oh, it's pancreatic cancer or it's a lung cancer of this sort down the microscope, but looking at the genome and other molecular markers. It's this pathway that's impacted and gone wrong, so let's use that drug for that pathway. So we need things like that. We need to be able to, you know, if you get someone having an early cardiac event, we need to go out and check their family and see whether they have risk factors and do things. I think the other big stuff that's coming, and I'm delighted to be on the board of the company that in Oxford that's leading it, Genomics PLC, is starting to look for risk factors and doing a simple screen, which is really quite cheap, and saying, you look as if over life you have these risk factors, and starting therefore to work with people to think, so I'm at high risk of breast cancer, so I do need screening, you know, once a year. I'm at low risk, so maybe I don't need screening at all, but if I do, maybe it's every 5 years. So starting to segment people, so screening it fits much more with your risk, and looking at these genomic risk profiles, and actually thinking about, so what does that mean for your lifestyle? And maybe explaining why uncle, you know, died early. So if I don't do this, that, and the other, maybe I will too.
That's quite exciting. So it's almost like personalized preventative healthcare and well-being in a way that benefits people, but then ultimately, I assume, would also benefit the whole healthcare system, right?
It ought to. Yes, it ought to. So I think that's going to be really exciting, but I think we will be using genomics more and more as first-line diagnostics, first-line screening, and use it more intelligently. As we learn more, we'll use it more intelligently.
Yeah, yeah. So we've got I always love when personal questions come in. So we've got a personal question on the regional versus national front. So someone says, I'm starting a national role next week after working regionally. What is your advice to someone in that position?
Oh, that's an interesting one. So I'll tell a story. Back in the late 90s, I was the regional director for research and development. And I was in North Thames, North London. 56% of the country's money was with me, and therefore 44% of the money was with 8 other regional directors, and they kept ganging up on me and trying to get the money out of North London, and it was pretty difficult. So eventually I went to see my boss and I said, you know what, the skills that got me this job are not the skills I need in this job to do it well. I need a new skill set. And being me, I said, so we have 3 choices. I burn out. I refuse that one. I leave. I might well, unless you pay to train me properly. So I went off to INSEAD to do a course on emotional intelligence and leadership. And the happy story is about a year later, one of them said, I don't know what you do differently, Sally, but you seem to always get your way without an argument. And I said, oh, right. So I think what I would say is, as you move up, think about what skills you do need to take with you and what new skills you need in that role. And then set about acquiring them. But don't assume that the ones that got you there are the whole suite you need for that position. And finding mentors or buddies to talk to kind of analyze that, tease it out and give you support can be really useful. I went on that course and I had quite a lot of leadership, executive coaching too, in order to end up as I am now. I remember saying to someone, gosh, the NHS spent a lot of money on me. And he turned around and said, well, look at your career, worth every penny, you know. And don't be embarrassed to ask for development. It's pays off.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. And I think relating that, I mean, obviously you're now the 39th Master of Trinity College and the first woman again to hold that position. How, in terms of your leadership approaches, how do you think your styles evolved over the years and across the different positions and roles that you've adopted?
Well, it's quite interesting. So I do a talk, which I'm not going to give you because you don't need it, about what it is like to be as a doctor, to be a leader at the local level, the regional level and the national level, and then going global, you know, working in WHO and all sorts of things. So I think there's those aspects, but I think there's also different styles. So when I was the Director General for Research and Development for the NHS, I managed to acquire out of the Treasury over £1 billion a year to spend, and I was the boss of this budget, on research in the NHS. Running that was power. It was executive power. Everyone wanted to be my friend. I then moved to CMO, and that role was all about advice. I had no power. I didn't have the budget. I had a small team. People would come and say, will you do this or that? And I'd say, I haven't got a budget. So that was about influence and advice. And moving to this role, it's changed again. Here, I chair the council, so I have a governance role, but my role is about facilitation, collaboration, leadership, about the style of what we are and where we're going, but it's about helping everyone do it themselves, all of us together. And there is no power. I have none at all. It's all about influence. So it's quite interesting. A lot of people, I think, in the business world get more and more power, but I haven't. Because I'm in the public sector, it's got more and more complicated.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's such an interesting way to think about it, because I think there's also an assumption sometimes that leadership is just this label, right? You're a leader. It's a badge. It's all the same. You're more senior. That's it. So it's really interesting and really useful, I think, to share that sort of nuance around how the leadership you've gone through, the journey has changed. And what I'm hearing is that your style has changed to fit whatever leadership position you've been in.
I think many of us can have different styles, you know, to be successful. You think, what do I want out of this meeting? Who am I meeting? How am I going to handle it? And have different styles. But different roles need not only different skills that I was talking about earlier, but different styles as well. They all need listening, of course, but, you know, when I was CMO, we'd have meetings and I'd listen to everything and we'd all agree what needed doing, or I'd say, well, clearly we need to do this to the policy team, and it would happen. Now, if I said that, everyone would say, oh, really? And are you going to do it?
Oh, wow. And we have another question on leadership. So the person says, hi, Yewande and Sally. Thank you for a fascinating discussion. My question to you both is if you could do one role with a focus on new ways of leading, what would it be and why?
Well, I did wonder about doing something in the private sector, but I realized that I'm not driven by, I mean, I'm well paid. You know, sure, I could spend more money, but I don't need it. I'm driven by values and wanting to make a difference. But I suppose it would be potentially a style change to go into the private sector and work there. But no, I'm not going to do it. Anyway, I don't need to now. I'm 70 and I'm here.
You can do whatever you want. But no, that's really interesting, because I'm probably on the reverse side, where I've spent my whole career in the private sector, always with kind of an itch to go either public or social. And I kind of dip my toes in a little bit. I do social kind of either in an advisory role or a board role. But, you know, I think for me, maybe because that's where I started, I love the private sector.
Yeah, well,
just don't tell anyone.
Maybe I would have done had I been in it, but yeah.
Yeah, very nice. Cool. And then one more, lessons learned from COVID. What do you think are the key lessons we can learn from our response to the current pandemic in order to improve our future pandemic preparedness and response?
Ooh, I think that's a very big question, and I'm sure we're going to end up with a parliamentary public inquiry and all sorts of things. Could we have prepared better? Yeah, we could. We could. Does just-in-time ordering work in a pandemic situation? No. Should we have more manufacturing in this country? Maybe. Should we have been using data as we do now before it even arrived? Oh, yes. Should we have had a more collaborative NHS earlier before it even arrived? Oh, yes. Yeah. So I think there'll be all sorts of things that come out, and we'll wish, all of us, that we'd done differently, because we all regret where we are. It's sad. Well, it's tragic that people are dying, but the important thing will be not to, cut people's heads off and put them on poles, but actually to learn the lessons and say, what do we want to do differently going forwards?
Yeah. And I think the topic of, you've raised a few different things with, technology obviously being a theme that kind of comes up because the power of it is just immense. If there was one technology improvement you could wave a magic wand and make, what would it be?
Well, I think we need ace broadband and then really good technology in the hands of everyone so that it is free to us all. And then to have it used for the NHS and education in not just state-of-the-art, but ever-improving ways.
Yeah. So thank you all for the questions from the audience. I'm going to ask a couple more questions just to close out. I think just given everything going on, COVID obviously continues to be kind of the topic of the day. But we know that miracles happen. So given your varied and remarkable career in science and research and development, what's the one thing you've always wanted to change about the sector and that you think would be a great change for good at this moment?
Oh, well, you've heard my views about technology and a modern collaborative and ever-learning NHS. So let me choose another. That is important. I'm not escaping that one.
Yeah.
And I think it would be that we need a society that recognizes the value of health, not just for the sake of health, but for happiness and the economy. And I think COVID is making people wake up to that. And then thinking that through, what does that actually mean? And it means that we should try and make sure we reduce pollution, that we reduce obesity, which means we need to work with companies so that they give standard sizes rather than the massive sizes of things like pizzas and chocolate bars, but also that they reformulate, and probably we agree to stop advertising, but we change our environment and we hold our companies responsible as part of our society, both in what they make and sell, but actually how they treat their workforces and how they help their workforces and through their workforces, the families of the workforce's health. And I would dearly love to see a society that really cares about health and brings together the public sector, the private sector, reduces inequality, and everyone works to improve health and independence.
That sounds amazing. I'd be excited to see that society. And you're right, I think and hope, I'm also very glass half full, that this pandemic which we're going through, which is very difficult for many people, will help us to kind of see that that's the society we want to live in as well. My very last question, and I always like to leave the last ones, is also very important. We've heard that your weekly newsletters are quite a mix. So most recently, I heard that you featured A.A. Milne, Winnie the Pooh, and Pooh Sticks, which is you would obviously expect from everyone listening right now. How do you come up with these themes, and what combinations are in the pipeline that you could give us a sneak peek of?
So this is a letter I'm writing with the help of colleagues to the Trinity community, students, fellows, staff. And I started it at the beginning of the lockdown, and we've talked about community grief and beauty and all sorts of things. And yes, I try and make it relevant to the college. So actually, A.A. Milne was a student of Trinity, and the original Winnie the Pooh books are in our library. I wasn't allowed to have a photograph of them because Disney would sue us, but we can after 2027. The copyright lapses, and then we can use it. So I try and find things that are of interest to talk about, that matter because we're all locked up, but that have relevance to being here. And I think we're going to talk this week probably about blood transfusion antibodies, because antibodies are being used to treat patients, and the fact that Wren, the architect, did some of the first transfusions in the world. So, you know, kind of linked around that. But we have to think hard. So what would be interesting? And then the other thing we add are pictures that I've taken on my slightly old iPhone. It's only an iPhone 5, wandering around the college. And I have taken some really beautiful ones. So they remind people of where they aren't. And we are living in total peace, with the deer coming out, a white egret the other day, a heron on the river.
Oh, lovely.
I mean, it is just beautiful. I'm very lucky.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Sally. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. From leadership to healthcare to the future, it's been so great hearing your insights. And thank you so much for your time.
Well, lovely to meet you too. So thank you very much, Yewande.
Thank you, Sally. I'm going to hand back to Maxine now to close out our session.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Yewande and Sally. That was an amazing conversation. And there were just kind of three things that I wanted to pull out from that really stood out for me, and I think would resonate a lot with the One HealthTech community. So one is the kind of deep acknowledgement of privilege, the fact that we can even be on a webinar right now, and the people who are watching this webinar are those least likely to be affected, and for us to make sure that we really pay attention to those who have had a very different experience of lockdown, be it from a socio-economic perspective or other factors. I think a second thing for me was this kind of tension between the international and national collaboration, and how important the regional element is. So one thing that we care a lot about is localized innovation, localized collaboration, and how that is even more relevant in the case of COVID. And you raise a really good case around data sharing and the fact that transmission happens at the local level. And for me, the third thing that really stood out for me was the idea of doing things differently, being values driven and focused on delivery. So that's everything from being kind of centered on public good in the work that we do, to also not being an honorary man and biting balls off, because that's also quite an important thing to do. So obviously the week, One HealthTech Week's theme is Coronnaissance, which, other than being a hilarious pun come up with our volunteers, obviously represents the fact that this week of activities is to provide both kind of levity and insight into a community of people who I think are really quite tired and wounded from 2 months of working hell for leather on different types of solutions. One thing that has come out is that, obviously after the war, there was the Beveridge Report, which really campaigned for important social progression. And I think one thing that this conversation really highlighted is that if we're going to be inspired to have what our one line of our Beveridge Report equivalent should be, what could that be? And so I hope that this conversation has inspired everyone to think really carefully about what their health care or life science innovation policy startup could do in advancing social progression in that element. So a huge thank you to Yewande and Sally. The recording will be made available, and please do continue the conversation on #OHTweek. Obviously, you're invited to the rest of the week's activity, and we've got everything from pajama yoga and virtual coffee mornings to more serious book clubs and article clubs about looking at gender disparity in COVID data, or what types of pivoting and reshaping and refactoring different startups have done during this period. So if you just look on